Now we're going to work on the exterior of the bag. So if your lining is a different color than the outside of the bag, you're going to want to change your thread on your machine. And I have the lower piece of the exterior bag here with the darts already sewn. That is the exact same process that you used for the lining. The other thing we're going to do here is make the tucks at the top. So there's 2 sets of tucks, and you're going to have your marks transferred from your pattern templates. And basically we're going to fold on the center mark and match the 2 side marks. So we'll start with this side, and your mark should be about 5/8 of an inch long, and we're going to just stitch down to the end of the mark and back stitch, and then we'll do the next step. Okay, I'm going to jump over here to the other tuck and do the same thing there. So I'm going to match those 2 outside lines and fold it on the center one. Okay, you can take your pins out. And then what we're going to do is basically we're going to flatten this little pleat we made here. So you're going to push that line that was on the fold down to meet the little seam that you just made. So your fabric is, it's kind of really an inverted pleat. So you're going to have the same amount of fabric on either side of that seam. So you'll pin those. And you can see from the front the effect that it makes. And then we'll do the same on this side. We're going to push that line down and line it up with the little seam you made and pin that. All right, and then we're going to machine baste these down. So basically we just want to sew those in place a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch, because our seam allowance is going to be 1/4 inch, so we want to make that a little shy of that, just so that when we make the actual seam we don't risk having those threads show. So if you want to just check this real quick before you stitch it and see if it's going to be the same length. Looks like we're pretty close. I'm going to go for it. Basically the next step is sewing this top part to this edge, so those need to be the same length. So you're going to go through a lot of bulk here, so just go slowly, and if your machine has a walking foot, that can also be helpful here. Okay, then we'll do the next set. All right, so now you have those stitched. I'll get rid of some of these threads. And I really like how the wool is taking shape here. It really has a nice body to it, and it's going to be really cool. So the next step is to sew the upper part of the outer bag down to the lower part. So we'll put those right sides together. And if you're, just to help you line this up a little bit, what you can do is fold each piece in half and find your center point and mark it with a pin. And that just helps when you're aligning things So we'll match those two pins up, and then we know our centers are aligned. And pin the edges. Okay, so now we're going to sew across there at 1/4 inch as well. So we've got a lot of bulk here, so just take your time. Okay, so we'll open this up. We can check along our seam. It looks like no basting is visible. It looks like a pretty good straight seam. So I'm going to give this a little press, and then we're going to top stitch along this edge above the seam line onto the upper part of the bag. And this interfacing I used is cotton interfacing. So I can totally iron on top of it and not have to worry about the heat melting the interfacing. But when I press from the wool side, I'm going to use a press cloth. And I like to press the seam allowance up because of the all this bulk here with these tucks. It's just, there's no way you're going to be able to press it down towards the bottom of the bag. So just go with the flow. And I'll give it one more press here. Again, a lot of times wool can mark when you iron it, and you don't want any iron marks messing up your project. So it's better to be safe and cover it with the press cloth. And then I would just avoid trying to iron the bottom part of the bag at all. It's just, you don't want any creases in these. I think they look nice when they're just sort of rounded. So this is all pressed. I'm gonna go sew this about, I don't know, 3/16 of an inch from that seam, just to catch that seam allowance and finish off the seam. Okay, so we're just going to top stitch along this edge, and as you go you can kind of feel the seam allowance with your fingers and just make sure that it's going towards the top of the bag. Okay, so we have the top stitching done, and basically this whole side of the bag is complete. So you're going to repeat all those steps to do the other side of the bag, which I already have done here. And then we are going to put them right sides together and basically sew them the same way that we did the lining. So we're going to pin the darts, line those up. We're going to line up our seams right here and the top edge, and we're going to sew all the way around. We don't have to leave a gap at the bottom. So I like to pin the intersections of the seams first, just to make sure those are lined up. And then I line up the darts. Now these are a little bulkier than the darts on the lining, so I'm going to go ahead and just trim that excess off. So I'm basically leaving like a 1/4 inch there. And then I'll line those up on this side. And the seam. And then I'll pin across the bottom. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and take this to the machine and sew at a 1/4 inch. Okay, so now we have our 2 sides sewn together, and we're going to do a little trimming on the edges and some pressing. So I'm going to turn this right side out and just check our seams. Everything looks pretty well aligned. And to get these curves really nice, it's a good idea to either clip the seam allowances or use pinking shears on those edges. And so I'm gonna pop this back out and trim those. So if you have pinking shears, it's great. You can just use those along the edges and it takes the little notches out for you. Like that. And what that does is actually it takes out a little notch of fabric, so then when the curve is reversed and that seam allowance is turning in on itself, there's less bulk there. And then I'm also going to trim these little flaps of seam allowance at the intersection here. And if you don't have pinking shears, you can just take the tip of your scissors and trim some little notches like that. Put But since I do have pinking shears, I'm going to use those. It's much easier and faster. All right, so let's look at those curves now. All right, they look a little more smooth now. So you can take your bag over to your ironing surface and do some light pressing. I'm just going to do this top seam here where it's nice and flat. And it's a good idea if you have an ironing board that's got sort of the point at the top, you can put the bag over that to help you shape it. Or you could also roll up a towel you know, to get into those curves and steam those out. But basically you don't want to flatten the darts and the pleats that we created. All right, so the next thing we're going to work on is the flap and the hardware closure that goes at the top of the bag.